August 17, 1859. The heat in Savannah did not sit on the skin so much as press into its salt, smoke, and something sour that clung to the rafters of the Broton Street auction rooms. Men fanned themselves with folded broadsheets while flies traced lazy circles over spit-stained floorboards. The bell rang once, a dry metallic peal, and the room's mutter thinned to a ripple, lot by lot. The morning had passed in familiar rhythms, a boy with strong shoulders and new scars, a woman with a steady hand for ironing, a pair of brothers sold together only because one planter feared the bad luck of tearing them apart. The regulars knew each other's tells, who bid with a twitch of the eyebrow, who stalled to frighten off rivals, who never bid on a Monday because he swore it cursed a harvest. When the clerk lifted his head and called, "Lot 43," the air itself seemed to rearrange. The woman who stepped onto the platform carried herself like the room, didn't own her name. No stumble, no flinch as the chain tugged her forward. She looked to be early 30s, skin like polished walnut, features clean and unbending, eyes a still, deep black that did not blink at shouted numbers or the scrape of boots. On another day, her listing would have stirred a small storm literate in English, experienced in household duties, midwife and herb doctor. Everybody knew there was money to be made in a skilled midwife. Fees from plantations near and far, when trouble came knocking at midnight. But as the auctioneer thumbed a smudge from his ledger and recited those virtues, the room answered with the sudden industry of looking elsewhere: ceilings, cuffs, the crust on the toe of a boot. Thomas Cornelius Peton had been in Savannah 3 weeks, long enough to memorize who mattered, not long enough to hear every whisper. 34. Dressed too sharply for the old family's taste. He was Charleston money with fresh edges and an inheritance bigger than his experience. He had bought the Waverly plantation site, unseen, on a bargain, 800 acres along the Vernon River. Columns cracked but still proud, 42 enslaved workers on paper, and an overseer named Hutchkins who shook hands like he meant to keep a man at arm's length. Hutchkins had told him 50 or 60 hands were needed to coax the maximum cotton from that fat, black soil. Thomas listened, nodded, and came to town with cash in a leather satchel, determined to buy his way into belonging. By noon he had spent $5,000 on 3 fieldmen and a cook whose fried corn cakes had a reputation of their own. He had also heard enough drawled pleasantries to learn the social math. New money was welcome, so long as it didn't boast. Mistakes, when made by the right last names, were called misfortunes, and every laugh ran 2 beats longer when the target couldn't hear. In the lunch break's shade, cigarettes burned down and talk drifted toward the afternoon session. 2 planters Thomas recognized from a dinner party leaned near the brick wall. "You staying?" one asked. "No reason. Heard they're finally selling her." "About time. Been in the holding pens 3 weeks. Nobody wants to buy. Not after Peton. Not after that." The second man saw Thomas glance their way and tightened his mouth. The first tipped his hat as if to end the conversation. The bell rang again. At 1 o'clock, the benches filled with fewer bodies. The opening lots moved brisk as a dealer's hands, a cooper with good references, a seamstress with dim eyesight, a boy whose height was more promise than present. Then the clerk, voice dulled by repetition, said, "Lot 43. The auctioneer didn't smile. Female, approximately 32. Name of Celia. Experienced in household duties, midwifery, and herbal practice. Literate in English. No known physical defects. Starting bid of $10. He sounded like a man reading a warning. He didn't write. $10, a joke of a number for a woman with skills that could line an owner's pockets year after year. Thomas waited for paddles to lift. None did. The room fell into a theatrical stillness, like a chapel where nobody prayed. $10. The auctioneer repeated, pen poised. Do I hear 10? Chairs creaked. Someone coughed. A fly lodged itself in the curl of a wig and buzzed there until a hand swatted it away. Thomas raised his paddle. 10 to the gentleman in the blue coat. The auctioneer said, relief leaking into his voice. Do I hear 12? Silence. except for the tallying of everything that wasn't said. Thomas felt the awareness in the room bend toward him and away again. The way a crowd shifts when a carriage rattles over cobbles. A few eyes cut to him like cautions. The auctioneer cleared his throat, going once at 10, going twice. The gavel fell like a small thunderclap. Sold. Celia looked at Thomas as if measuring a distance only she could see. It wasn't gratitude. It wasn't fear. A recognition crossed her face, quick and cool, like the exact moment a man understands a bargain is not a gift. Paperwork made everything legal that human decency would never make right. The office clerk's pen scratched. When Thomas asked about Celia's origin, the nib hesitated just a heartbeat before the clerk's voice returned to neutral. From the Peton estate, he said. Property liquidated after Mr. Peton's death 3 months past. Her skills accurate. That's what the inventory says. The clerk lifted his eyes, only long enough to make it clear he was not curious on company time. Your total is 6,710. Thomas signed. The number registered like a well-thrown stone, real weight, real splash. Then gone. On the street, afternoon heat collected in the gutters. He caught the tail of a conversation as a pair of older planters shuffled by. 4 men dead in 2 months. Doctor said influenza. Convenient. That. She was there for all of it. The words were not meant for him, but they followed him out of town anyway. The river road peeled south, a ribbon between live oaks that bowed like judges. Waverly's main house stood whitewashed and weather-battered behind magnolias, 6 columns across the portico, like a boast that hadn't heard last winter's wind. To one side, 2 long rows of quarters framed a dirt lane. Beyond, cotton stuttered in neat squares toward the tree line. Hutchkins met the wagon with a palm that signaled where to put who. Fieldmen to the left, the cook down to the kitchen, and Celia Hutchkins scratched his jaw. Celia to the old overseer's cabin near the quarters. Got old patients tending births and fevers, he said. Woman's done it 40 years. Then Celia can assist her, Thomas said. 2 pairs of hands are better than 1. Hutchkins nodded, but his mouth didn't agree. As you say, sire. Before Thomas could press the point, a houseboy announced a visitor. Josiah Crenshaw waited on the portico, a man who wore his years like good linen heavy. Carefully pressed, he had shaken Thomas's hand at a dinner the week before and watched him with the faintly amused suspicion reserved for new arrivals with big talk. They took bourbon that neither man finished. I noticed you were in town, Crenshaw said at last, as if small weather had passed. Heard you made some purchases. Several, Thomas said, measuring plain words against the need to make an ally, including a midwife for 10. Crenshaw set his glass down carefully. Did you wonder why nobody else bid? The thought crossed my mind. Peton's woman, Crenshaw said. Dr. Harold Peton dead now. Healthy until he wasn't. Overseer dead before that. And the driver too. And Peton's physician. 4 men in 8 weeks. If you count the way a rumor counts. Rumors count different depending on who tells them. Truth does too. Crenshaw leaned forward an inch. That woman prepared teas and tonics in Peton's house. She had reason. He told Thomas an outline. And in that outline was a daughter, the same age as Summer, and a whipping no decent man should watch, and the smell of calomel and stale whiskey drifting from a doctor's mouth. He did not say the word vengeance. He did not have to. The evening fell slow and gold over Waverly. From the quarters, a harmonica stitched a thin thread of sound through the heat. When Thomas walked to the old overseer's cabin, Celia was sitting on the narrow bed, hands unbound, back straight, as if a rope ran through her spine and up into the roof beams. She stood when he entered, and her eyes met his like 2 pages set flat on a table. You are Celia? Yes. Master. I'm told you have skill as midwife and herbalist. My mother had the skill before me, and her mother before her. I learned by watching, and then by doing. A pause. And I can read. I learned by books too, when books came my way. The frankness startled him more than any insolence would have. He thought of the men on Broton Street, the sudden stillness, the way a room can pretend not to know what it knows. "You came from the Peton place," he said, keeping his voice square. "There were deaths. People die," she said. "That part ain't news." "The timing," he began, and she tilted her head a fraction, a gesture that landed somewhere between pity and warning. "White folks always talk," she said, "especially when they don't understand something." "And what don't they understand?" Her silence lasted long enough to be an answer. When she did speak, it was with that same steady measure, that dead come due, one way or another. This world balances. It could have been a preacher's remark. It could have been a threat. He chose to call it philosophy. "You'll work as midwife here," he said, "with old patients, tend the sick, deliver babies, prepare medicines as needed." "Yes, master. And whatever happened at Peton's that stays there, we start fresh." A flicker crossed her face then, like a candle tugged by a draught. "Yes, master," she said, understood perfectly. In bed that night, ceiling plaster mapped with hairline cracks like tiny rivers, Thomas listened to the slow tick of the hall clock and measured himself against the room's stillness. He thought about the girl who had died at 16, and about a doctor's hands that shook for the wrong reason, and about a mother tied to a beam in a barn that smelled of manure and rust. He thought about herbs that eased pain and herbs that mimicked fever, about knowledge carried in memory when laws denied everything else. Mostly he thought about a sale that was supposed to be a bargain and felt instead like a contract he hadn't read closely enough. On Broton Street, the gavel had sounded like certainty. Out here, with river heat pressing through the shutters and a far-off dog barking at nothing, certainty thinned to a thread. Somewhere outside, the night breeze turned a live oak leaf over, and the world kept its secrets 1 hour longer. The morning sun at Waverly came slow and heavy, a thick golden sheet sliding across the veranda and over the veranda columns like syrup. Thomas stepped out into it, adjusting his waistcoat, the air already hot enough to draw sweat under his collar. The plantation was quiet except for the rhythmic ring of a hammer from the blacksmith shed and the distant cough of someone starting the fire in the cookhouse. In that silence, Waverly looked almost stately, 2 stories of peeling white paint and cracked columns that gave the illusion of permanence. But behind the main house, the illusion frayed. The quarters stretched in 2 narrow lines down the slope toward the cotton fields. Roofs sagging, smoke rising from breakfast fires. Every sound carried a crying child, a low hymn, the rasp of an old man's cough. Thomas paused at the rail, surveying his estate like a man rehearsing ownership. Waverly was supposed to be a symbol of his ambition, a monument to his father's fortune and his own name. He'd left Charleston to escape the shadow of old Puit money and the endless sneers of men born to plantations older than the Republic itself. But Savannah had its own hierarchies, and new Southern money was an insult uttered with the politeness of venom. He had come here to make himself untouchable, to turn cotton into legacy. Yet every legacy began the same way, with control. And control was what he meant to keep. When Hutchkins arrived with the morning report, his boots were already powdered with the white dust of the fields. The overseer was a narrow man, hair thinning, eyes a pale grey that rarely blinked. "We're short 12 hands for the lower field," he said without greeting. "If we don't fill those rows, we'll lose a quarter of the harvest." "I've already secured 4 new men," Thomas said, "and a woman, Celia, to assist with the medical work." Hutchkins posed. "You mean the one from the Peton estate?" Thomas glanced at him. "You know her." "I've heard of her," Hutchkins said, his tone so measured it almost hid the unease behind it. "Rumors travel faster than wagons in this county. Best you keep her busy. Sire, idle hands with that kind of knowledge can stir more trouble than cholera." Thomas bristled at the implication. "You believe in gossip. I believe in patterns," Hutchkins replied, "and I've seen enough sickness that didn't come from nature to know when a man ought to be careful." He tipped his hat and turned back toward the fields. Thomas watched him go, noting how the workers stiffened when Hutchkins passed. Fear kept order, better than respect ever could. But something in the man's rigid efficiency unsettled him. By noon, the heat had grown unbearable. Celia worked near the quarters, setting up her space in the small cabin once used by the former overseer. Thomas rode by on horseback, ostensibly inspecting the new arrivals, though curiosity was his real reason. Through the open doorway, he saw her sorting bundles of dried leaves and glass jars on a rough-hewn shelf. She moved deliberately, each motion quiet and certain. When she noticed him, she didn't bow or avert her eyes. "You settling in?" he asked. "Yes, master. You'll have the freedom to tend to the sick here. Hutchkins may bring cases to you." She nodded once. "There's sickness here already. The child in the last cabin has fever. The woman with him's been giving river water. Bad choice in this heat." Thomas frowned. "I'll have her instructed to boil it." "No need," Celia said, already reaching for a jar. "I'll handle it." The simplicity of the statement irritated him and impressed him at once. He wanted to remind her of her place, things of hierarchy and obedience, but something in her tone, the calmness, not defiance, made the words dry in his mouth. That evening, a carriage crunched up the drive, and Josiah Crenshaw descended like a man made of tobacco and authority. His waistcoat was cream-colored, the buttons gold. Thomas greeted him with practiced charm, offering bourbon and shade. "You're settling in well," Crenshaw said, settling into a chair. "Waverly suits a man with ambition." Thomas smiled. "You sound like you disapprove." "I don't disapprove of ambition," Crenshaw replied, swirling his drink. "I disapprove of ignorance that often travels with it." He glanced up, eyes sharp. "You bought the woman, didn't you, Peton, Celia?" "I did. $10. Crenshaw's brows lifted. "Then you either made the bargain of the century or the worst mistake you'll ever pay for." Thomas leaned forward. "You mentioned at the auction that she had a reputation. Tell me what you know." Crenshaw's voice lowered, as though the veranda itself might overhear, but Peton's doctor died first. "Influenza," they said. Then his driver broke a neck in the stable. His overseer took favor, raving before he died. Then Peton himself, right in the parlor, slumped over a glass of brandy, all in less than 2 months. He sipped his drink slowly. Celia was in that house the whole time, made their teas, mixed their tonics, tended their meals. "You think she poisoned them?" "I think she had cause," Crenshaw said. "Peton's physician, Dr. Vance, killed her daughter with his arrogance. The girl was 16, feverish. He bled her and dosed her with calomel until her lips turned black. When Celia spoke against him, Peton had her whipped. Badly. I saw the marks myself." Thomas stared at him. "And you believe she took revenge?" Crenshaw's gaze hardened. "I believe she understands the difference between healing and killing better than most men in this county, and that she doesn't see much difference between the two if justice is involved." He set his glass down. "Sell her, Mr. Pruitt, or put her in the fields where she can't touch the food or the medicine. She's dangerous." Thomas said nothing. Crenshaw stood, adjusting his hat. "I came here as courtesy. What you do with the information is your choice. But remember, justice looks different when the law was never written for you." After he left, the air felt heavier, the night closer. Thomas walked down to the quarters where lamps flickered like fireflies between cabins. He saw Celia again, her figure framed in the doorway of the old overseer's hut, the light behind her painting her silhouette against the dark. For a moment, she looked almost spectral, a shadow between two worlds. He thought of Crenshaw's warning, then of the feverish child she'd cured that morning, already sleeping peacefully now. He told himself the talk was superstition, the paranoia of old planters clinging to folklore and fear. Still, when he lay in bed that night, he could not stop replaying Crenshaw's words. "She doesn't see much difference between healing and killing if justice is involved." He had bought Celia to make Waverly thrive, but the longer he stared at the ceiling, the more he wondered if he had invited something else entirely, something that didn't answer to profit or control. Outside, The cicadas sang their endless dirge, and in the far cabins, a single low voice carried a song older than the plantation itself. The kind of song that survived chains, storms, and centuries, a song that didn't beg for mercy but promised balance. When Thomas finally closed his eyes, that melody followed him into uneasy sleep, humming of debts that never stayed buried. By late September, the lowland air along the Vernon River carried the taste of rain and the dull hum of insects that never slept. Waverly Plantation moved through its routines like a machine that refused to stop field hands rising before dawn. Overseers barking commands that blended with the creak of wagon wheels and the soft rip of cotton pulled from its bolls. Yet something was changing beneath that rhythm. The new woman, Celia, had begun to draw quiet attention. At first, it was suspicion. The other enslaved people whispered that she talked to the plants in the herb garden behind the quarters, that she marked the soil with symbols no one recognized and murmured words that didn't belong to English or any tongue they knew. Children followed her at a distance, convinced she could cure fevers with a touch or call snakes out of the grass with a glance. When an infant born too early took its first strong cry under Celia's care, the murmurs softened. Fear was giving way to something else, respect. Even Hutchkins noticed. The new woman, he muttered one morning to Thomas, ain't like the others, knows things no book could teach. Thomas only nodded, pretending to focus on the ledger before him. The truth was, he'd seen the same thing. Since her arrival, not a single serious illness had taken hold at Waverly. Cuts healed faster, fevers broke sooner. Even the older workers seemed to carry themselves with more strength. It might have been coincidence, it might have been weather, but the thought of coincidence felt thin when Celia walked through the fields, her presence somehow steadying, of her expression unreadable. Then came the storm. It started with the faint warning of gulls flying inland and the smell of salt too sharp for the season. By dusk, the wind had turned the river white with foam, and the trees leaned like men against an unseen force. Hutchkins urged Thomas to have the cotton picked early. If that storm hits before we finish, you'll lose half the year's profit, he warned. Thomas ordered extra hours. The fields filled with bent backs and sweat-soaked shirts long after dark. Celia worked beside old patients, the midwife she was assigned to, tending to children while the storm gathered offshore. When it finally struck, it did not arrive, it attacked. The hurricane screamed through Waverly, ripping branches, tearing shingles from roofs, hurling debris like stones. Rain hit in walls, each drop hard as shot. Thomas watched helplessly from the portico as part of the slave quarters roof tore away, vanishing into the night. He had never heard anything like that sound before, the roar of the wind blending with human prayers, a chorus of terror swallowed by thunder. 18 hours later, the storm was gone. Waverly stood battered but not broken. The cotton fields lay half-flattened, and several cabins had collapsed, but the damage was less than Thomas had feared. He ordered the repairs immediately, trying to mask the relief that threatened to show. For 2 days, he thought the worst had passed. Then the sickness began. It started among the children, fever, coughing, shivering so violent it rattled their thin beds. By the second day, 3 adults had fallen ill. By the third, more than 20. The doctor from Savannah arrived in a black carriage that looked funereal before it stopped. He was young, pale, and nervous. After examining the sick, he prescribed calomel mercury chloride standard treatment for fevers of the humid season. Dose them every 6 hours. The doctor said, "It will purge the poison." Thomas paid him and watched the man hurry back to town, unwilling to stay a minute longer among the infected. That evening, he found Celia in the quarters, moving from bed to bed, a cloth tied around her mouth, her hands steady even as she bent over the shivering bodies. Old patients followed close behind, trying to match her movements. "The doctor says calomel," Thomas told her. Celia didn't even look up. "Calomel kills faster than the fever. It's what doctors use." "Doctors," she said quietly, "kill more than they save." Thomas frowned. "Then what would you do?" She lifted her eyes to him. "No calomel. Willow bark for pain." honey and garlic for cough, elderberry and boiled water, and keep them apart from the well ones. He hesitated. You believe it spreads? I know it does. Air carries sickness like gossip. It moves fastest through the ones too proud to believe it. Thomas said nothing for a long moment, then finally nodded. Do it your way. For 3 nights, the quarters glowed with lamplight. Celia mixed teas by the fire, whispered instructions to the children, and kept watch through hours when even the crickets stopped singing. The fever broke in the first patients by the 4th day. By the end of the week, the sick had either recovered or died, and only 2 of the elderly were lost. Word spread faster than the storm had. By early November, neighboring planters began sending word to Waverly, asking to borrow the midwife who had stopped a plague. Some sent wagons, others came themselves, hats in hand, murmuring about miracles as if embarrassed to use the word. Thomas, seeing opportunity, allowed it for a fee. Celia traveled between plantations under escort, treating everything from childbirths to yellow fever. Each success made her legend grow. But power, in the south of 1859, never went unnoticed. At first it was admiration, the grudging, kind white men reserved for something they don't fully understand. Then came unease. The same neighbors who praised her healing whispered, if she can cure, she can kill. Hutchkins overheard it too. They're saying you keep a witch on the property. He told Thomas one afternoon. Some call her doctor, some call her curse. Thomas tried to laugh it off, but his throat felt dry. That night, as he rode back from inspecting the fields, he saw something strange, a small circle of candles flickering in the dark behind the quarters, and Celia standing alone in their center. She was murmuring softly, her voice low and steady. It wasn't prayer in any language he knew. She held a sprig of something green, perhaps sage, perhaps something older, and as the wind bent the flames, the smoke seemed to rise in deliberate patterns, curling like writing across the air. Thomas dismounted quietly. The rational part of him, the man of business and inheritance, told him it was superstition, simple ritual. Yet as he watched, the hair on his arms lifted. When Celia finally turned toward him, she didn't startle. You shouldn't walk so quiet. Master, she said, startles the spirits. He tried to find a reply and failed. She smiled faintly, as if at a private joke. Don't worry, she added. These are the good ones. For now. That night, he wrote in his ledger that Waverly had made its first profit since he arrived. The crops were salvaged, debt paid, and the sick recovered. Yet even as he set down the numbers, the memory of those candles burned behind his eyelids. Somehow, he knew the harvest had been paid for in something more than sweat. The hurricane had left the land bruised. But Waverly breathed again. The air smelled of mud and crushed leaves, and the trees leaned as though remembering the storm's grip. Yet it wasn't the broken fences or flooded rows that unsettled the people of the plantation. It was what came after. 3 days following the fever's retreat, a chill spread through the quarters that had nothing to do with weather. One morning, Hutchkins appeared at the main house, pale as paper. You need to see this. Sire, he said, his voice shaking. Thomas followed him down the path behind the cabins. A crowd had gathered around the north wall of one of the outbuildings. The murmuring stopped when he arrived, the bodies parting with a soundless deference. On the wall, drawn in what looked like blood or thick clay, was a symbol, a circle with lines radiating outward, smaller rings orbiting it like planets. In the center was a handprint, large and deliberate, the palm pressed deep enough to leave creases of skin. Thomas felt something twist low in his stomach. Who did this? No one spoke. Then an old man stepped forward, Daniel, one of the senior field hands. His back bent, but his eyes clear. That's an old mark. Master, he said carefully, from the coast of Africa, before my grandmother's time. It's for warning. It means somebody's calling on powers that don't forgive. Hutchkins spat into the dirt. Which signs? He muttered. Rote work. I'll find who did it and make them wish they hadn't. Paint it over, Thomas ordered. keeping his voice steady. "And tell everyone this foolishness stops now. There'll be no talk of spells on my land." They washed the wall clean before nightfall, but the fear did not wash away with it. That evening, the plantation felt different, quieter, as if listening. The frogs along the river had stopped their chorus, and even the dogs barked only once before falling silent. Thomas tried to dismiss it as nerves, as the lingering aftershock of the storm, but when he passed Celia's cabin, he saw the faint glow of lamplight leaking through the cracks in the shutters. Inside, she was writing in her notebook, the neat script catching the candle's flicker. For a long moment, he watched, uninvited, until her voice reached through the thin wood. "Watching from shadows isn't polite, Master." Thomas froze. The chair creaked inside. Then her tone softened. "If you've come to ask about the mark, I didn't make it. I wasn't accusing you," he said, though the denial came too quickly. "Good," she said, "because sometimes the land remembers what people try to forget. Storms stir things up, roots, bones, memories." "What does it mean?" he asked. "Depends who you ask," Celia said. "To some, it's protection. To others, warning. But mostly, it means balance is near." He hesitated. "Balance. The scales," she said simply. "They never stop moving. When something tips too far, the world finds a way to even it out." He left without another word, though her voice followed him, threading through the dark like smoke. 2 mornings later, Hutchkins's hunting dog was found dead by the well, its body stiff, mouth ringed with foam. "Poison," Hutchkins said, crouching beside it. "Fast-acting. He was fine last night." Thomas stared at the well. The water shimmered, innocent as glass. "Could be a snake bite." "No bite marks," Hutchkins replied. "Hemat Gaze," and the unspoken question passed between them. That night, the house felt heavy. Every door creaked louder. Every gust of wind seemed to carry whispers. Thomas took to walking the veranda with a lantern, the light trembling against the columns. He told himself it was for security, but the truth was simpler. He couldn't sleep. Then came the next death. Samuel, a strong field hand, began complaining of stomach pains late one afternoon. By evening, he was curled on the floor of his cabin, body twisting, vomiting until the straw mat beneath him was slick with bile. Celia was summoned. When Thomas arrived moments later, she was kneeling beside the man, her face grave. "This isn't fever," she said. "It's poison." Thomas felt his chest tighten. "How can you be sure?" "I've seen it before. Skin pale, veins showing through, stomach cramping like this. It's not sickness from the air. It's something he ate or drank." "Who would do such a thing?" Celia's eyes lifted slowly. "The question isn't what poisoned him, Master. The question is who wanted him to die." Samuel convulsed once more, then went still. His final breath left him with a sound almost like a sigh. The room filled with the smell of fear and sweat. The next morning, Thomas questioned everyone who had eaten with Samuel. The answers led nowhere. The food had come from the communal pot, the water from the same well. No one admitted to a quarrel. There was no motive, no weapon, just the lingering dread that death had started to choose its own schedule. For the first time since his arrival in Georgia, Thomas felt the sharp edge of something he couldn't control. Money could repair roofs, pay doctors, buy workers, but it could not buy certainty. He returned to the main house and poured himself bourbon he didn't taste. On the table lay the plantation ledger, its clean lines of profit and loss. For every column of order, there was chaos beneath it. Out the window, the quarters were still. Somewhere in that darkness, he knew, Celia was awake, mixing something in a bowl, or writing in her notebook, or simply waiting for him to understand that balance, as she called it, was not a thing a man could own. The next day, he ordered new barrels for the well, had the kitchens scrubbed with lime, and posted guards near the quarters. But he could not guard against whispers. They slipped through walls, through the very air. By sunset, Even the bravest workers were glancing towards Celia's cabin when they thought no one was watching. One woman muttered, "She calls the sickness." Another answered, "No, she sends it away." Both might have been right. Thomas closed the shutters early that night. The sound of the river rose and fell outside. Steady and patient, he lay awake until dawn, replaying her words in his mind. The scales never stopped moving. The December cold came without warning. A week earlier, the air had still smelled of damp cotton and sugarcane smoke, but now frost spread silver over the fields each morning, and the breath of every worker hung like ghosts above the rows. The plantation felt quieter. Even the river seemed to move more slowly, as if the world were holding itself still. But silence never lasted long at Waverly. It began one evening with screaming. Thomas was in the study, reading by lamplight, when the noise broke the fragile calm, a woman's voice, shrill and jagged, echoing across the yard. He grabbed his pistol and hurried outside. The sound led him to the well behind the quarters, where a crowd had gathered, torches lighting terrified faces. Two men held a young woman back from the edge, her bare feet slipping in the mud as she struggled against them. "It's Ruth," someone whispered. "The laundry girl." "Let me go," she screamed. "They're coming for me, I can hear them. They're inside my head." Thomas stepped closer, his breath clouding in the cold. "What's happening here?" Hutchkins pushed through the crowd, eyes wide. She tried to throw herself down the well. "Sire." Daniel and Joseph caught her. Ruth's hair stuck to her face, her eyes wide and wild, fixed on something no one else could see. "They won't stop," she sobbed. "They keep whispering about what I did to him." Thomas raised a hand. "Ruth, you're safe now. Just breathe." Her body went rigid at the sound of his voice. Then, with a trembling gasp, she said words that froze every heart within earshot. "I didn't mean to kill him." The name she didn't speak hung in the air anyway, Samuel. A ripple went through the crowd, a single shared intake of breath. Thomas felt the world narrow around that moment. "What did you say?" Ruth didn't answer him. She was staring at someone else now. Celia had arrived, silent until that instant, moving through the circle of light, as if the torches bent toward her. She looked at Ruth not with pity, but with understanding. Two women speaking in a language of grief the rest of the world couldn't translate. "You know," Ruth whispered. "You understand? Tell them what I did." Celia's voice was low, steady, like the river when it's deepest. "Hush now, child. No need to tell anyone anything. What's done is done. What's coming will come." "I didn't mean it," Ruth cried. "I just wanted him to hurt like he hurt me. I didn't know the mushrooms would kill him." Thomas's stomach turned. "You're saying you poisoned Samuel." But Ruth wasn't looking at him. She was pleading with Celia. "Make it stop. The voices, the shadows, make them stop." Celia touched two fingers to Ruth's forehead. That her gesture slow, almost tender. "Can't stop what you started. Child, you opened a door, and now you have to walk through it. All I can do is ease the way." Thomas stepped forward. "What are you giving her?" Celia reached into her apron and produced a small glass bottle. "Valerian, chamomile, a touch of poppy, to calm her." Ruth drank without protest, her body sagging into the men's arms. Within minutes, the struggle left her. Her breathing slowed, her eyes fluttered shut. "Take her to the empty cabin," Thomas ordered. "Watch her through the night." The crowd dispersed slowly, muttering, avoiding his gaze. Celia turned to leave, but he caught her arm. "What just happened?" he demanded. "You heard her confession." Celia met his eyes. "I heard a broken mind talking to ghosts. She said she killed Samuel. She said she didn't mean to." Celia replied, "There's a difference. You gave her something. What was in that bottle?" "I told you," Celia said calmly. "Something to help her rest. Sometimes rest is the only mercy left." He let go of her arm. She turned, her voice drifting back over her shoulder. "You seem afraid." Master, you should be, not of me, but of the things people keep inside when the world tells them they have no power. When Thomas returned to the house, he poured whiskey with shaking hands. He told himself it was exhaustion, not fear, but deep down, he knew the truth power had shifted again. Quietly, without his permission, Ruth died 2 days later. She never woke from the sleep Celia had given her. The body was discovered at dawn, pale and still, her face peaceful as if she'd finally found silence. Celia declared it heart failure brought on by distress. No one questioned her, no one dared. At the burial, Thomas stood among the mourners and noticed something unsettling. The workers no longer looked to him for orders or comfort. They looked to Celia. She stood at the edge of the grave, head bowed, lips moving in prayer or something older than prayer. When the last clump of earth fell, the crowd echoed a soft hum, low and rhythmic, like the beginning of a storm. That night, Thomas couldn't sleep. The sound of that hum still pulsed in his head. He rose, dressed, and walked to Celia's cabin. Through the cracked door, lamplight revealed her sitting at the table, writing again. He pushed the door open. "I need to know the truth," he said. She didn't look up. Truth about what? Master. Ruth. Samuel. The sickness. All of it. Celia dipped her pen and continued writing. "Truth is like medicine," she said. "Given in the right dose, it heals. Given too much, it kills." "Did you teach her how to use those mushrooms?" "She asked me about plants," Celia said softly. "I told her which ones heal and which ones don't. What she did with that knowledge wasn't mine to control." "That's not an answer." She set down the pen and finally met his eyes. "You think knowledge itself is guilty. The blade don't choose who it cuts. The hand that holds it does." Thomas stepped back. "Uneasy," she confessed. "Then she died. You call that coincidence?" Celia smiled faintly, though it never reached her eyes. The mind can only carry so much guilt before it looks for a way out. Some doors are softer than others. He wanted to accuse her of murder, but the words died before they reached his lips. There was nothing in her expression, no fear. No pride, no denial, only certainty. When he left the cabin, the moon was high, washing the quarters in cold light. For the first time, Thomas realized he didn't know who truly ruled Waverly anymore. The next morning, he found her in the garden, tending to her herbs as if nothing had happened. "You're free to leave the quarters," he asked. Celia plucked a leaf and held it to the light. "I go where I'm needed. You should be glad of it. Master, there are worse things than a healer who knows when debts are due." Her words lingered in the frost-bitten air long after she walked away. And for the first time since buying her, Thomas felt the full weight of the bargain he'd made. He had not bought a woman. He had invited a force. Winter settled over Waverly like a closed hand cold. Silent, unyielding, frost turned the fields into sheets of white, and every breath hung heavy as smoke. The days were short, but the nights stretched on endlessly, filled with sounds Thomas couldn't explain: the faint creak of the house when no wind blew, the whisper of footsteps that stopped when he turned his head, and the occasional murmur of voices from the quarters that carried too clearly through the stillness. Ruth had been buried 2 weeks, but her presence lingered like perfume that refused to fade. Workers crossed themselves when they passed her cabin. Hutchkins swore he saw her shadow moving against the window once, though the door was bolted from the outside. Celia said nothing. She tended her patients, delivered babies, and moved through the plantation as though she were made of smoke, seen, respected, feared. Thomas's thoughts grew darker with the days. The words she'd spoken, "debts come due," had rooted themselves in his mind like a weed he couldn't pull. He tried to busy himself with ledgers, with the repairs to the storm-damaged roof, but his mind always circled back to her, to the calm in her voice when she declared Samuel poisoned, to the peace on Ruth's face after Celia's medicine, and to the question that now haunted him: what else does she decide? One night, after too much bourbon and too little sleep, he made up his mind. He would find out for himself. When the quarters had gone quiet and the moon rose over the river, Thomas took a lantern and walked to Celia's cabin. The door was latched, but the window was open a crack, letting the smell of herbs drift out into the cold. He hesitated only a moment before pushing the door open. The small room was spotless. Dried bundles of plants hung from the ceiling like ghosts in rows. Bottles and jars filled the shelves, their contents labeled in a delicate, educated hand. On the table lay a half-finished page of neat script, her ink still wet. He set down the lantern, knelt, and searched. Beneath the bed, wrapped in cloth, he found a wooden box. The hinges groaned softly as he opened it. Inside lay several notebooks, their pages covered with her fine handwriting. At first, it was all recipes, mixtures for fevers, burns, childbirth pains, but then he noticed another tone between the lines: reflections, observations, judgments. He began to read aloud, barely whispering. October 15, 23 sick, 21 saved. The power to heal is the power to choose who lives. They think my knowledge belongs to them because they own my body. But knowledge can't be owned. It can only be shared or withheld. He turned the page, pulse quickening. Every life saved is a debt in my favor. Every death permitted is a weight on the scales. When the balance is right, justice will be served. His hands trembled. She wasn't merely a healer, she was keeping a ledger, a tally of life and death. He flipped further. December 20. The girl came to me in tears, told me what the man did to her, wanted him to hurt. Naught D. I gave her knowledge and let her make her own choice. Then I planted guilt deep, with careful words. Guilt is slower than poison, but it kills all the same. When she cannot bear it, I will give her peace. Mercy and judgment are the same coin. Thomas felt the blood drain from his face. Ruth. She had written about Ruth before the girl had even confessed. He set the notebook down and noticed another item in the box, a folded sheet of yellowed paper, older than the rest. Edges brittle with time. The handwriting was different, rounder, more careful. My daughter, if you are reading this, I am gone, and the knowledge is yours alone. The plants are neither good nor evil. We make them so. Heal when the scales are fair. Harm when justice demands it. Keep the ledger. Record all choices. We are not slaves, though they call us such. We are keepers of the old ways. This knowledge makes us free. It was signed Phoebe, March 1838. Celia's mother. Thomas stared at the page until the candle guttered low. Then he heard a sound behind him, a soft creak. Find what you were looking for. Master. He turned sharply. Celia stood in the doorway, shadowed by the moonlight, her expression unreadable. She stepped inside, closing the door behind her. I had to know, he said, voice unsteady. And now you do. Her eyes fell to the box. Put them back. He hesitated. You call this justice, deciding who deserves to live or die? I don't decide, she said quietly. The scales do. The scales are your invention. Celia tilted her head slightly. So are the laws that let you own people. We all make systems to justify our power. At least mine balances something. You killed those men at Peton's place. She didn't deny it. Dr. Vance killed my daughter while he was drunk and called it medicine. Marcus held me down while they whipped me. Kelly laughed while I bled. Peton owned us all. You tell me. Master, was it murder? Or was it payment? Thomas swallowed hard. And what of Ruth? That was payment too. Ruth came to me for help. I gave her knowledge. She chose her path. The guilt finished the work. I simply guided her home. The words chilled him. Guided. She was drowning, Celia said, her voice almost tender. I showed her how to stop fighting the current. He wanted to call her monster, witch, murderer, but none of the words fit. She was too calm, too certain, and part of him, some small, shameful part, understood her logic. What about me? He asked quietly. Do I fall on your scales too? Celia's lips curved. Not in mockery, but in something closer to pity. Not yet. You're learning. But the scales remember everything. She moved closer, her shadow merging with his in the lantern light. You see, Master, power isn't just what men write on paper. It's what people believe you have. The ones in the quarters, they believe I can heal, and they believe I can harm. That's more freedom than any paper in Savannah could grant. Thomas's throat was dry. If I reported you, if I had you taken away. Her gaze didn't waver. You won't, because too many here owe me their lives. Because without me, this place would rot. And because part of you already knows the truth. The world you built runs on injustice. I just make the accounts honest. She walked past him, picking up the notebook from his trembling hand, sliding it gently back into the box. You think you're a good man. Thomas Puit. But you live off the blood and bones of others. The only difference between us is that I admit it. He couldn't answer. When she opened the door, the cold air rushed in. Fluttering, the pages still spread across the table. She turned back once, her face half lit. Your hands are clean only because someone else's are dirty. The scales see that too. And then she was gone, leaving him alone with the smell of ink, herbs, and truth too heavy to breathe. That night, Thomas sat awake until dawn, staring at the horizon. Somewhere in the darkness, a rooster crowed. He thought of the ledger, of Phoebe's letter, and of the woman who kept balance by her own reckoning. He had bought her for $10, and he realized, for the first time, the real cost was still being counted. The new year of 1860 crept in without celebration. A thin frost glazed the windows of Waverly's main house, and the river carried slow sheets of ice along its edges. Inside, the fire hissed and popped, throwing long shadows across the floorboards. Thomas sat before it, staring into the flames, seeing faces instead: Peton, Ruth, Samuel, all blurring into one another like the ghosts of unpaid debts. He hadn't slept properly in weeks. Every time he closed his eyes, Celia's voice echoed back. The scales remember everything. He tried to tell himself he was still master of his own land, that law and property and the entire weight of the South stood behind him. But law couldn't banish the unease curling in his stomach, and property meant little when fear had already taken root in the heart of the owner. He'd begun avoiding her, sending messages through Hutchkins or the field hands, yet even in her absence, Celia was everywhere. Her garden behind the quarters had doubled in size, rows of herbs now stretching toward the tree line, neatly labeled and tended by women she had begun teaching. She called them helpers, but Thomas knew better. It was an apprenticeship. Each time he passed, he saw their faces calm, purposeful, watching him without lowering their eyes. Once, he overheard one of them say softly, "Celia says healing ain't just for bodies. Sometimes it's for what's been broken inside." He wondered if she was referring to him. Then, one bitter morning, Hutchkins appeared at his door. His skin was grey, eyes bloodshot, voice hoarse. "Mr. Puit," he croaked. "My wife's taken ill." Thomas followed him to their cabin. The woman lay in bed, trembling, her breathing shallow. Celia was already there, spooning a dark liquid between the woman's lips. "What is it?" Thomas asked. "Something to ease her pain." Celia said, "She won't suffer long." The certainty in her tone made his stomach twist. For a week, the overseer's wife wasted away her body, shrinking until her wedding ring slipped off her finger. Celia tended her daily, always calm, always kind, whispering prayers Thomas couldn't understand. On the 7th morning, she died. The moment Celia closed her eyes and murmured a final blessing, Thomas turned to her. "You knew," he said quietly. Celia wiped her hands on a cloth. "I told you she wouldn't suffer long." "What did you give her?" "Relief." "That's not an answer." Celia looked up at him then, her expression soft but unyielding. "Hutchkins was at Peton's place," she said. "He held the rope when they whipped me." "You didn't know that?" The air in the cabin seemed to stop moving. Thomas felt his pulse hammer in his throat. He's paid enough. He's worked hard here. He's alive because I let him be, she said. But his wife was part of that balance. You think justice forgets, it only waits. She stepped past him, leaving the cabin. Hutchins collapsed into a chair, hands covering his face. 3 days later, he stopped showing up for work. By the week's end, he was drunk every afternoon, wandering the yard, muttering that he should have saved her. The once efficient overseer who had run Waverly like a clock had become a hollow shadow. Thomas didn't need Celia to tell him what would come next. One evening, he heard a gunshot from Hutchins's cabin. By the time he arrived, the man was slumped over the table, his pistol still in hand. Beside him sat a half-empty bottle, the same one Celia had once used to mix laudanum for his dying wife. Daniel, one of the field hands, found Thomas standing there and spoke quietly. Some folks die long before the body quits. Sire, he just caught up to himself. Thomas stared at the bottle. The label was faint, the handwriting unmistakable. Celia's. That night, he confronted her. She was outside her cabin, tending to her garden by lantern light. You knew he'd do it. Thomas said. She didn't look up. Everyone dies of something. He chose his own means. You gave him the poison. Medicine, she corrected. Same thing in different doses. You murdered him. Celia finally turned. Her face was serene, almost sorrowful. He murdered Mercy the day he laughed while I screamed in that barn. This was simply the echo. Thomas felt his throat tighten. Do you hear yourself? You speak like a god handing down judgment. I'm no god, she said. Just a woman who learned the difference between laws made by men and laws that keep the world in balance. He shook his head, stepping back. You don't understand what you're doing. Oh, I understand perfectly, she said. The question is, do you? The following week, Daniel was promoted to overseer. Exactly as Celia had once predicted, the workers accepted it without protest. In fact, for the first time since Thomas had arrived, the plantation ran smoothly, almost peacefully. Cotton bales moved in neat rhythm. Tools were maintained. Berths were safe. The field hands worked with a quiet discipline that no whip could command. But beneath that order, something invisible pulsed a shared understanding that the real authority on Waverly no longer wore a waistcoat or sat in the big house. It wore a plain grey dress and kept a garden that could kill or cure. Celia's influence spread beyond Waverly's fences. Planters from neighboring estates arrived at Thomas's door, hats in hand, asking to borrow her for ailing workers. Difficult births, mysterious sicknesses. Thomas agreed every time, partly for the money, partly out of fear of what might happen if he refused. She traveled under his name, but not under his power. Each time she returned, she brought something new, a pouch of seeds, a handwritten note, a quiet smile that said she had added one more thread to whatever web she was weaving. When Thomas asked where the seeds came from, she said only, from friends who still remember the old names of things. At night, Thomas wrote in his own journal, Power doesn't shout anymore. It whispers through the walls. I thought I owned her. Now I think I was just the instrument she needed. I tell myself I'm being practical, letting her stay for the plantation's sake. But I know the truth. I'm afraid of her, and more afraid of what happens if she leaves. By February, Hutchins's death had become just another line in the ledger of Waverly. The work went on. The cotton gins turned, and the riverboats carried bales to Savannah. From the outside, the plantation looked prosperous, but inside, a strange peace had settled, one not built on obedience, but on balance. One evening, Thomas passed by the quarters and saw Celia sitting among her apprentices, teaching them by candlelight. He couldn't hear the words, only the rhythm of her voice, steady, confident, old. The women listened with rapt attention, nodding, their faces illuminated by soft flame. For the first time, Thomas saw what she was really building. It wasn't rebellion, not yet. It was something slower, more dangerous, a legacy, a network of knowledge that couldn't be whipped out of existence or burned down with the quarters. He thought of his father, who had always said that power came from land and labor. Thomas realized now how wrong that was. Power came from belief, from who people trusted to save their lives or end them. And on Waverly, no one trusted him anymore. They trusted her. That night, Thomas dreamed of scales tipping in the dark, the sound of metal scraping against stone, and a woman's voice whispering, "Every debt is paid eventually." When he woke, his heart was pounding, and the first light of dawn was spilling across the floor. He looked out toward Celia's cabin and thought, not for the first time, that perhaps the reckoning had already begun. By early spring of 1860, whispers of Celia had drifted far beyond the boundaries of Waverly. The planters along the Vernon River had begun to speak her name in low tones over bourbon glasses, half in gratitude, half in dread. In nearby Chatham County, they said she'd cured a child of yellow fever when the doctor had already ordered a coffin. In Liberty County, she'd supposedly resurrected a woman who had stopped breathing during childbirth. And at one plantation farther west, a man swore that Celia had foretold his overseer's death 2 nights before the man fell from his horse and broke his neck. None of the stories agreed on the details, but they all agreed on one thing wherever Celia went. The balance followed mercy or punishment, healing or ruin in perfect symmetry. Thomas pretended not to care about rumors, but every letter that arrived from Savannah merchants, every passing visitor who mentioned her name, only deepened the tension in his chest. He had wanted prosperity. Instead, he'd become the custodian of a legend. One afternoon, as he rode back from the lower fields, he found a stranger waiting in the courtyard, a thin man with a hawk nose and an air of impatience. His coat was travel-stained, his boots spattered with red clay. "Benjamin Peton," he introduced himself curtly. The name hit like a hammer. Peton, nephew of that Peton, the late master whose entire household had perished under Celia's watch. "I believe you have something that belongs to my family," Peton said. "A woman." Thomas's pulse quickened. "Celia is legally mine. Purchased at auction." Peton smirked. "You can keep the papers, Mr. Poet. I'm here for the truth, not the property. I've come to learn how she did it." "Did what?" "Cursed an entire estate into the grave," Peton said, stepping closer. 4 healthy men, all dead within weeks. My uncle's house rotted from the inside out, and at the center of it stood that woman. You bought her cheap, but you'll pay dear when your turn comes." Thomas forced his voice steady. "You're repeating gossip." "Gossip," Peton's eyes glinted. "I exhumed the bodies myself, every one of them blackened at the lips. Veins dark as ink, poison or plague, take your pick. Either way, she walks free while men of name lie on the ground." Before Thomas could reply, the door of the house opened. Celia stood there, framed by the sunlight. For a moment, no one spoke. Peton's confidence faltered, his eyes widening just a fraction, as though he'd come face to face with something half-remembered from a nightmare. "You're far from home, Mr. Peton," Celia said evenly. "Digging up graves you helped fill." Peton stiffened. "I filled nothing. I'm here to warn this fool you've bewitched." Celia smiled faintly. "Witchcraft, no. I only use what nature already gives. Men like your uncle called that witchcraft because it scared them to see power in the wrong hands." Peton turned to Thomas. "She'll ruin you, same as she ruined them. When she's finished balancing her precious scales, you'll be on the other side." Then, without another word, he mounted his horse and rode off down the lane, dust rising behind him like smoke from a gun. That night, Thomas found himself unable to sit still. The image of Peton's sneer and Celia's calm reply gnawed at him. He took to walking the halls, pausing by the window whenever the wind shifted. The plantation, once a symbol of triumph, now felt like a stage built for an ending he couldn't see. 2 days later, Crenshaw came calling again, the same man who had first warned him at the auction. He looked older now, the lines around his mouth carved deep. "You've got trouble, Thomas." he said without preamble. That Peton boy's stirring up talk. Says your midwife is spreading poison across 3 counties. Thomas poured them both whiskey. Talk is wind. Crenshaw didn't drink. Wind can start fires. The magistrate's sniffing around, and some of your neighbors think she's building herself a following. Thomas exhaled slowly. Following? She's teaching, Crenshaw said. Not just herbs. Ideas. About balance. About how every soul has worth, no matter what paper says otherwise. I heard 2 women from Bannister's place whispering that Celia's words are freedom dressed in patience. Thomas felt the blood drain from his face. Freedom dressed in patience. She's not calling for revolt. Crenshaw continued. Not yet. But mark me, knowledge is slower than gunpowder, and twice as hard to put out, once it sparks. When Crenshaw left, Thomas walked out into the evening. The air was thick with the scent of blooming jasmine, deceptively sweet. Down by the quarters, the faint glow of candles flickered between the cabins. He followed the light. Inside one of the cabins, Celia sat surrounded by 6 women. The table was covered in jars, dried roots, and sheets of paper scrawled with careful script. Thomas recognized the shape of his own handwriting on some of them. She had copied pages from his account books to teach the others how to read and write numbers. They looked up as he entered, but none of them stood. Evening, Master, Celia said. We were just talking about healing. Is that what you call it? He asked quietly. She smiled. Words heal too. Letters. Numbers, they make a person more than property. Thomas's voice dropped. You're teaching them to defy me. No, she said. I'm teaching them to understand the world that pretends to own them. That's not defiance. That's preparation. For what? She paused, then looked him dead in the eyes. For the day the scales tipped for everyone. The room seemed to shrink. The women didn't flinch. Their faces were calm, illuminated by the steady glow of the candles. For the first time, Thomas realized this wasn't rebellion in its loud, fiery form. It was something quieter and far more enduring. When he left the cabin, the night air felt colder than it should. In the days that followed, Celia continued her work, unbothered by his scrutiny. Ich dam, she walked the rows of herbs, her apprentices following like acolytes. At night, songs drifted from the quarters, songs with strange, haunting harmonies that carried through the dark. Thomas stopped pretending he could control it. He told himself he was keeping the peace, that Waverly needed her, that removing her would cause panic. But deep down, he knew the truth. He had lost authority long ago. What remained was appearance, a mask worn for the world, while the true order of things rearranged itself beneath. When he rode into Savannah a week later, he heard something that froze him. In a tavern near the docks, a trader laughed over his ale. You all heard about the witch doctor of the Vernon, the man said. They say she can make a white man choke on his own lies from 10 miles off. Laughter followed, but underneath it Thomas sensed unease. The world was changing, word by word, rumor by rumor, and at its center was a woman he'd once bought for $12. By the time he returned to Waverly, dusk had fallen. Candles burned in almost every cabin, their glow synchronized like stars arranged with purpose. Celia stood outside, her silhouette framed by the light behind her. You heard it too, she said without turning. Heard what? That they're calling me witch. Thomas swallowed. You don't seem afraid. She turned then, her eyes catching the faint light. Fear is for those who still owe the world something. I've paid my debts. The crickets were loud that night, the river louder. Somewhere deep in the dark, thunder rumbled, though the sky was clear. Thomas realized he was trembling. He had once believed himself the master of Waverly. Now he was only its witness. The summer of 1860 came with a kind of fever that no herb could cure. It wasn't in the body, it was in the air. In the whispers of men who gathered on courthouse steps, in the nervous glances exchanged in town squares. The South was fracturing. Talk of secession swelled like a storm rising over the Atlantic. and every planter, merchant, and politician could feel the thunder coming. But inside Waverly Plantation, another kind of reckoning was already underway, one quieter, older, and infinitely more personal. Celia's garden now stretched beyond the quarters, creeping toward the main house like a living map of her influence. Even Thomas had stopped pretending it was a simple herb plot. Some of the plants he recognized: mint, sage, comfrey. Others had no names he knew, only small wooden markers written in what looked like an African script. He never asked her what they meant. Some knowledge, he had decided, was safer, unspoken. One evening, as he reviewed the ledgers in his study, the sound of hoofbeats broke through the cicadas. A rider approached dust-covered. Disperate. It was Benjamin Lell, the rice planter Celia had once mentioned in that strange conversation months before. The man dismounted before the horse even stopped. "Mr. Poet," he gasped, "I need your help. My daughter's dying." Thomas stood slowly, every word echoing something Celia had said long ago. "She's 17. Lel continued. "Fever, coughing. The doctors bled her twice. She's worse. They told me you have a woman here, one who saved others when no one else could." Thomas said nothing for a long moment. Then, curtly, "Her name is Celia. I don't care what her name is. I'll pay anything, anything." Thomas looked at the man, and behind his panic, he saw guilt. A memory flickered the conversation in Celia's cabin, when she had said Lel was there at the Peton plantation the day of her whipping. He had seen her suffering. He had turned away, and now he stood before her old master's successor, begging for salvation. Thomas almost pitied him. Almost. "Wait here," he said. He found Celia in the garden, trimming leaves from a plant that smelled faintly of cloves and bitterness. "There's a man here," he said. "Lel. His daughter's ill. He's begging for your help." Celia didn't look up. "I told you this would happen. You knew he'd come. I knew his debts would find him eventually." Her voice was calm, but her hands moved slower, more deliberate. Thomas hesitated. "Will you go?" "That depends." "On what?" "On whether the scales demand mercy or remembrance." He stared at her. "You'd let his daughter die for something he did years ago." Celia finally met his eyes. "He watched my child die and did nothing. The scales never forget inaction. Master, it weighs the same as cruelty." Thomas felt the old tension rising, fear and admiration intertwined. "If you refuse, he'll go to the magistrate. He'll call it witchcraft." Celia smiled faintly. "They already call it that. The difference is, now they call it in whispers." The wind stirred through the herbs, carrying the faint rustle of leaves. After a long silence, she said, "Tell him I'll see the girl." When Thomas returned, Lel was pacing the veranda, hat in his hands, face drawn and pale. "She'll come," Thomas said simply. The man nearly fell to his knees in gratitude. Within an hour, Celia rode off with him, a small satchel of herbs hanging from her saddle. Thomas watched them disappear down the road, the dust swallowing them both. For 3 days, there was no word. On the 4th morning, a carriage appeared at the gate. Celia stepped down alone, her clothes travel-worn, her face unreadable. "She'll live," Celia said before Thomas could ask. "Lel's daughter." She nodded. "The doctor was killing her with his cures. I stopped him. She'll recover in a week." "And Lel?" He begged, cried, promised the world. "But I didn't take his money." "Then why did you go?" Celia looked past him toward the fields, the horizon glowing orange with sunset. "Because mercy teaches better than revenge. He'll remember that every time he sees his daughter breathe, that's worth more than his death." For the first time in months, Thomas didn't know what to say. He followed her gaze toward the fields. Workers were finishing the day's harvest, their movements steady, almost peaceful. The plantation that had once been a place of fear now moved with a strange equilibrium, an unspoken rhythm that Celia had orchestrated. "You could have killed him," Thomas said quietly. "I could have," she agreed. But I've learned that fear only changes behavior. Understanding changes hearts. She turned to him then, her voice lower. Don't mistake me for kindness. Master, I gave him mercy because the world we live in doesn't have enough of it. But mercy doesn't erase debt, it just delays collection. Thomas nodded slowly. You're teaching them, he said. Not just healing, philosophy. Celia smiled faintly. The old knowledge was never about herbs. Thomas, it's about power, the kind no man can sell or buy, the kind that outlives chains. He studied her in the fading light, the set of her shoulders, the quiet confidence that no law could crush, and he realized with a kind of awe that she was already free. Not legally, not yet, but in every way that mattered. That night, Thomas wrote in his journal, she healed the man who once watched her bleed. She spared the daughter of the one who turned away. Her justice frightens me because it's purer than mine. I am trapped by laws. She is guided by balance. And in that, I see a world being born that I can neither control nor stop. The next morning, Celia came to him with a simple statement. You've seen what I am. Thomas, what I do. You've read my mother's letter. You know the scales. So now I ask you, where do you stand? He swallowed hard, on the side that wants to survive what's coming. She nodded slowly. Then start learning, because the old world you were born into is dying. And when it's gone, the ones who understand balance will be the only ones left standing. As she walked away, Thomas thought of the rumors spreading across the South of uprisings, of abolitionists, of revolutions whispered in the cotton fields, and he wondered if what Celia had built here at Waverly, the garden, the teachings, the apprentices, wasn't just survival, it was foundation, the quiet beginning of something vast. Autumn came early that year. The air turned brittle, the cotton fields gold under a sky too still for comfort. Savannah's streets hummed with talk of war. Secession was no longer a threat whispered in taverns. It was a promise carved into every man's voice. But for Thomas Peton, the true conflict wasn't being fought in distant capitals or courthouses. It was happening here, within the 800 acres of Waverly, between the world he was born to defend and the new one quietly rising under Celia's hand. She had become something more than healer now. Merchants, overseers, even the wives of neighboring planters came seeking her advice. Some came for tonics and cures, others for secrets that had nothing to do with herbs. Celia never refused them. She only listened, prescribed, and in her calm, deliberate way, made each one leave, believing she'd given them exactly what they deserved, be it hope, guilt, or clarity. The more Thomas watched, the clearer it became she was no longer his. He might own the land, the house, the deeds, but the heartbeat of Waverly answered to her. He saw it in Daniel's posture, in the way the workers paused when Celia passed. She didn't need to command. They simply followed. One evening, as the last of the sunlight burned through the Spanish moss, Thomas sent for her. She arrived as she always did, silent, self-possessed, eyes unflinching. I'm freeing you, he said. The words felt foreign on his tongue. Celia studied him for a long time before speaking. Woe. Why now? Because you already are, he said. All that's left is to make the world admit it. Her gaze softened, but only slightly. And what do you expect in return? Nothing. Maybe peace. Maybe forgiveness. There's no forgiveness for what built this place. Thomas. Her tone wasn't cruel, only tired. But there is balance, and maybe that's close enough. He handed her the papers. Manumission under Georgia law official. Notarized. Final. It would raise questions among the other planters. Of course, releasing a woman so valuable, so dangerous, would be called madness. But Thomas didn't care. He had crossed the line between master and believer months ago. When she signed the papers with her careful hand, she didn't smile. Instead, she said quietly, freedom, written by the same men who wrote bondage, is just ink. Real freedom's what you give yourself. She rose to leave, but paused at the doorway. You've learned something, Thomas. Not everything, but enough. He looked at her, Enough for what? To survive what's coming. Her words lingered long after she left. In the weeks that followed, rumors of secession became fact. South Carolina broke first, others followed like falling dominoes. Soldiers drilled in nearby towns, and talk of war grew louder with every passing day. Thomas no longer thought of politics in terms of loyalty or treason. To him, it was simply the world tearing itself apart. The inevitable collapse Celia had predicted, but Waverly stood. Somehow, impossibly, it thrived. The fields stayed full. The people worked not from fear but from strange devotion. Celia still lived on the property, though no one called her servant anymore. She was Miss Celia now, a healer, a teacher, a quiet power woven into the land itself. Her garden flourished even in the chill of winter. Thomas noticed she'd begun training girls from neighboring plantations, women who came secretly at night, carrying scraps of paper and vials of herbs. When he asked her once what they were learning, she replied simply, "How to remember, because memory is the first step toward freedom." He never asked again. The years ahead would become history war, fire, ruin. But the story of Celia and Waverly didn't end in the ledgers of generals or the proclamations of presidents. It lived in whispers and lineages, in women who carried small bags of dried herbs through battlefields and burned towns, healing whoever they could. Some said Celia left Georgia before the first cannon fired. Others claimed she stayed, turning Waverly into a refuge for the wounded white and black alike, treating them with the same cold mercy she'd always shown. There were even those who swore her descendants still kept her journals, hidden in plain sight among old family Bibles. Their ink faded, but their philosophy intact. The power to heal is the power to choose. The scales never forget. Balance is the only justice. In his final years, Thomas Peton kept a diary. The last entry, dated December 31st, Peton read, "I bought Celia for $12 and thought I'd purchased labor. Instead, I bought truth. I learned that power built on injustice always carries its own ending within it, and that mercy, when wielded by those once denied it, can be more terrifying than vengeance. The world is shifting. When it settles, it will not belong to men like me. Perhaps that is right. Perhaps, when the scales at last are even, that will be the closest we come to grace." He died a year later, quietly, in the same house where he'd once believed himself master. No one recorded what became of Waverly after the war, but travelers spoke of a place on the river where wild herbs grew in perfect symmetry, untouched by flood or fire, and of a woman's presence that lingered long after her body was gone. They said, if you walked the fields at dusk, you could still hear her voice in the wind, calm, patient, resolute, reminding the living that every debt, in time, is paid.